let's go ahead and do the meeting beginning ritual, everyone. 起立，面向佛堂，参加三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位点传师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. Okay, so time is at a premium for us today because of the shorter meeting. So I'm going to not get into a whole lot of preliminaries and just dive right in. So as you can see, spring ritual today, we're going to have to end earlier than usual. So we have about 50 minutes available to us. Next Sunday, Mother's Day, no online meeting. There's probably going to be a Mother's Day event here. So I myself will not be here at the temple, just so everyone knows. After that, in the month of May, we'll get into 39. I actually have the translation of 39 tacked on to the end of this presentation today, but because of the rich topics that we're getting into, I am not so sure that we'll be delving into 39 at all. So if not, then today is just for Q&A, and 2 weeks from now, on the 17th of May, we begin with 39. Spend 2 Sundays on that, and then 2 Sundays on 40, etc. And then until the 14th, no meeting for that weekend. On the 14th, by the way, there's not going to be any of the ordained masters here at the temple because they will all be traveling to Taiwan along with some people that will be accompanying them. So, moving on. So let me just reiterate briefly. Last time we talked about the ancient history of the Tao Te Ching, how it came to be, and how is it that people are able to tell the difference between the sentences, the verses, the chapters. So what I have done in reviewing that material, we began to get into it last time, but then I thought I want to make sure that everybody has a pretty solid grounding on the history of the Tao Te Ching. So I took one step back, as you can see here, and I added one slide to the presentation to establish that foundation. So let's take a look at what it says. So first of all, we have Li Er. This is the actual name of Laozi. The first character is the surname. That's Li. That is the same Li as Bruce Lee. Of course, for Bruce Lee, the old way of romanization was L-E-E, and that's how it was spelled back in those days. The new romanization system used in mainland China, it is spelled L-I instead of L-E-E. L-E-E, it's pronounced the same. It's the same character. It's a very common and popular surname for the Chinese. So Li, that is the family name. Is the given name. So some Chinese people have 2 characters in the given name. Some have only 1. So basketball player Yao Ming, he has only 1 given name, which by the way is Ming. Yao is the family name. It comes first. I personally have 2 characters in my given name, whereas the surname is just 1 character. Most Chinese people's surname is 1 character only. Rare exceptions, maybe 1% of the population has a compound surname with 2 characters. Okay, so Li Er, this is how it sounds. This is the real name of Laozi. So he was said to have been born 571 BCE, means before current era. So we used to say BC, before Christ, AD, after the death of Christ. Well, actually, it's not that. The people think it's that, but it's actually not. But we used to say BC, AD. The more scientifically, historically accepted way today, academically accepted way today, is CE for current era. that goes from year 0 to 2015 today. And then before current era, that's what BC used to be. So if you do some calculations, simply add 571 to 2015, you get a number that Lao Tzu was born nearly 2,600 years ago, roughly 2,600 years ago. Now, we don't know how long he lived, but we know that he was already elderly when he wrote the Tao Te Ching. So we can guess maybe he was around 80-some years old. Okay, that'd be a reasonable guess. And therefore, the writing of the Tao Te Ching was roughly 2,500 years ago, give or take maybe a decade. Okay, so we can say that with a great deal of certainty now that it was almost exactly 2,500 years ago, give or take. And because of the learning, because of the mastery that that he had, that Li had, people gave him the honorary title of Laozi, the old master. So here, I want to just reiterate something that I've been saying and repeating, is that never listen to people who have no idea and just repeat what they hear about the history of the Tao Te Ching and then say things like, Laozi means old son or old child. No, it doesn't mean that. It never meant that, except in the imagination, in the fertile imagination of Western students, dabblers into the Tao, who thinks it's actually kind of neat. So, Zi or Zi has always meant master, as in the master of knowledge, master of learning. It never meant anything else in this context. When you combine it with other words, it can mean child or son, but not in this context. Lao means old, and this is it's a common practice in Chinese society to accord a great deal of respect to the seniors, to the elderly. So, teacher is Lao Shi. It's the same character. Lao means old, and then Shi means someone who has specialized knowledge, someone who teaches. So a literal translation would be like old teacher, but Lao Shi can be someone who's actually quite young. They are called Lao Shi only because it is a term of respect, and that respect is the same respect that is accorded to the elderly, to the seniors. Therefore, it is an extra level of respect to call someone not just a zi, a master, but the old master. Therefore, Laozi. So that's him. When he wrote the Tao Te Ching about 2,500 years ago, that's a nice round figure for us to work with. Now, the next person for you to know about is Wang Bi. So he happens to be another Chinese person with only one character in his given name, Bi. And the first character, Wang, is the surname. So this is the same character that used to be W-O-N-G. So if you know Chinese people, some of them may still have that spelling for their surname, W-O-N-G, and that is the old style of romanization. The new style is W-A-N-G. It's not Wang, it's actually Wang. So not the A sound like apple, but the A sound. So Wang Bi. So who was he? He was a scholar. He was a young scholar. He was a well-respected young scholar, and this is these are all historical figures. So you can tell that this is a person who lived roughly 1,800 years ago. And I have the @ sign there to show approximation. We can also use C dot as circa. So roughly 1,800 years ago. So if you compare the 1,800 here in red with the 2,500 here in red, then you can easily tell that 7 centuries, 700 years elapsed between the time that the Tao Te Ching was first written to the time of Wang Bi, the young scholar. So he's a significant figure. Why? Because the version of the Tao Te Ching that has persisted throughout history in China is the version that he worked on to consolidate. This is because from 2,500 years ago to 1,800 years ago, there were variations of the Tao Te Ching. There were multiple versions of the Tao Te Ching. So at the time that Wang Bi had demonstrated his mastery of the ancient versions, there was a great need for someone to step forward and take on the task of consolidating all the different variations into one unified version of the Tao Te Ching. So this is what he did. The significant thing about him is that because, so he was considered to be a prodigy, even from a very young age, with mastery that was well beyond that of his contemporary peers. So the work that he did received almost universal wide acclaim from the other scholars, was very well accepted, was widely agreed to be the authoritative and definitive version of the Tao Te Ching. Now, we don't know which versions he gathered together to do his work. That process was never documented. We just had the end result. So the end result, the important thing you want to keep in mind is that starting from about 1,800 years ago up until today, so 18 centuries, during all that time, there's been one unified version of the Tao Te Ching. So the one, that one is the one that we study. That one is the one that we translate. So because of a lack of clear understanding about how that process works, there's been Western students, scholars that want to go back to versions before 1,800 years ago to dig up an older version that they would then claim is more authentic, like closer to Lao Tzu's original version. So there's no such thing. And I'm going to talk about a couple of older versions, you know, and you can get a sense for the evolution of the Tao Te Ching itself. It was, back in those days, nothing of that sort could be done without royal sponsorship, imperial sponsorship. And that's, so on the one hand, you would receive all kinds of assistance, all kinds of cooperation, because there was an imperial decree. On the other hand, if you did something that was wrong, if you did something that you had just made up, your life could then be in danger. So it's a double-edged sword. So so guys, if you calculate from the time of birth to the time of death, he died when he was like 23, and that's pretty young. Now, he was not executed. He died because he had gotten ill in ancient times. Sometimes an illness that today we would consider to be quite curable, back in ancient times was quite fatal. Even infection, even wounded in combat, if you don't dress your wounds, if you don't disinfect, that could turn into an infection. You could die from that, you know, and maybe a relatively minor cut. So that's a fact of, that's an unfortunate fact of life back in those days. So so those are the important points to remember. 700 years and then one unified version. So now we're going to explore the time between 1,800 to 2,500 years ago, because for the longest time, all that anyone knew was the unified version. They call it the received text, the received version of the Tao Te Ching. All that anyone knew was the unified version. The other variants, the variations that he had worked with to consolidate and unify, those have not shown up anywhere. So there was only one version that people have been studying and translating. But then later on, archaeology uncovered findings that was between the two. So within that 700-year period, there were discoveries dated to within that time, which is what we started talking about last time. And yes, AD is Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. Absolutely correct. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Mark, for that clarification. Now let's move on to the Tao Te Ching. That's what we are all here to talk about, to hear about today. So last time I talked about two discoveries. So back in the 1970s, prior to that time, we all thought that there was just one version of the Tao Te Ching, but then a discovery at Ma Wang Dui. So this is the first three characters. Ma Wang Dui, that's the name of the place. Ma, it means horse. In this case, it's a surname. There are many Chinese people with that surname, Ma. So that's this part. Wang, that's this part. That means king. It's also a surname. In this case, it means King Wang. Dui is a mound, like a small hill. So this was assumed to be the tomb of that particular king. But later on, as the actual tomb was discovered and the material came to light and was analyzed, it was discovered that it was actually not the burial tombs of Ma Wang, the ancient king. Instead, it was a nobleman, his wife, and their child. So it was a tomb containing three people. Then we have the last two characters. We have silk, and then we have book, translated as silk text. So out of this, dated to about 2,200 years ago. So to refresh the memory, you can tell that is between 2,500 years ago and 1,800 years ago. So the excitement among archaeologists, sinologists, was that this was actually older than the oldest version of the Tao Te Ching we had, which came from 1,800 years ago. They were able to show a version that was 400 years older than that, closer to the time of Laozi. And here you see a photo showing that. Now, silk had been used as a writing medium back in those days, but it was only affordable to the very wealthy or the very highly positioned in society, such as royalty and nobility. So this was, of course, the tomb of a nobleman, his wife, and the son, and therefore they had silk as something to write on. And this is a photo of that. Because of the passage of time, it has started to disintegrate. But fortunately, high-resolution photo scans were still taken before things had gotten too much worse. And they discovered, as they examined this version of the Tao Te Ching, that it was different in one primary way, that the second book of the Tao Te Ching came before the first book. They also saw that many of the characters on the silk were incomplete, like a partially written character. The overall impression is similar to someone writing shorthand. Maybe when another person is reciting something or dictating something, you want to catch up with that as quickly as you can. So you will just write a few letters in a word so that you can come back to it later on and complete it. So that's what it looks like. That's what it seems like. And we have no other context on how the silk texts were actually written. We don't know by whom. Could be the child, for instance, who's still learning the Tao Te Ching at that time. So we have no other clue. And we don't know what version, what variants this was. All we know is the date and the texts themselves. There's a large degree of correspondence or similarity with the received text from Wang Bi here. but then there are also some differences. So it was not enough to supplant the received version, the unified consolidated version, as the standard version of the Tao Te Ching, but it was definitely something that shed light on the ancient origins of this text. So everyone thought that this was the oldest version of the Tao Te Ching until this other discovery later on, which was a couple of decades after the discovery of the Ma Wangdui silk text. And here, Guodian, that is the name of a place. It's actually a village. So you'll see that, Guodian, here. Two slips, these are bamboo strips that have writing on it. And this is even older than the first discovery, and you can tell just by looking at the numbers, which I have in red, that it was more than 100 years older than the other discovery. Now, here we have more context on what that is. We can see that it's a more official or more formal version of the Tao Te Ching, because the person who was buried there was a elderly scholar, a teacher of a prince who later on became the king of Chu from the end of the Warring States period, toward the end of the Warring States period. So this was more like an authoritative figure. And so I have now the Tao Te Ching was not the only thing that was kept by this particular scholar. He had a wide range of learning in many different subjects, as one would expect. If you want to be the one that teaches royalty or nobility, you have to have depth, but also breadth of understanding, many different subjects, many different texts. And that's exactly what was discovered in his tomb, in the tomb of this ancient scholar. So many different texts, including the Tao Te Ching, they were all on bamboo strips. So there was a painstaking method of transcribing what is on the bamboo strips, which you see every other line is a bamboo strip, and then rendering into modern traditional Chinese. So this is traditional Chinese characters, not simplified characters. This is actually not the Tao Te Ching, this is some other ancient text, but this is just illustrating the process. And I also wanted to have the photos there because I want to show you that in the silk text, it is indeed true that you can't really see a break in any of the characters. And that is also the case when you look at the bamboo, that you can't really see that all the characters seem to be evenly spaced apart. So there wouldn't be like an extra long spacing to indicate where one sentence ends and the next one begins. So both of these lend credence to the original question, like how could people tell? How could people tell where the breaks were? That is exactly what we're here to answer today. That is the subject of our discussion as we're delving into this. Like I said before, sort of like Indiana Jones, talking about archaeology, talking about history. So here I'm gonna show you some additional findings. So later on, so the development of writing is like any other technology. It follows an exponential curve. Things get better and then better again and better again, successively better, each generation building on the previous generation, and then progress after that becomes very fast. It like shoots straight up. So here you're gonna see a shot of a manuscript which was on paper now, and paper was invented 600 years later, 600 years after the original writing of the Tao Te Ching. So we're talking, if you take a look at the chronology that I presented to you previously here, it's like 1900 years ago. So at the time that the young scholar Wang Bi had came onto the scene, paper had been had been in widespread use for about 100 years. So he himself had no trouble obtaining the paper that he needed to write the Tao Te Ching. Okay, back to this right here. This is a shot of a combination of Tao Te Ching and commentaries. So the characters here, the larger characters are the original Tao Te Ching, and the little text are the commentaries along the way. So there's a couple of things to notice here that I'm going to point out. Here, 体道章第一, this is the title of chapter 1, or verse 1. Over here, 养生章第二, this is the title of chapter 2. So, there is a clear distinction between chapters, and we can then tell that, oh, okay, well, chapter 1 ends over here. Now, down below, I have the large characters taken from the original one by one. So if you look at the first few, here's the first character, Dao, Ke, Dao, Fei, Chang, Dao. Compare that to Dao, Ke, Dao, Fei, Chang, Dao. So everything else follows character by character, but excluding the small characters, which are commentaries. So if you have a lot of time on your hands, you may feel compelled to follow that and compare the picture to the extracted text over here, and I think you will eventually be satisfied that indeed every single large character is represented down here. And also, you can tell that as we have the commentaries here, along the way, there are hints of where a line begins and the next one, where the line ends and the next line begins, because it could be accompanied by a commentary. But then there are also some commentaries that are within the line itself. So this is not definitive. There are clues as to where certain things begin and end. If you look at the last 4 characters, 众妙之门, that's over here, these 4 characters, okay? And then the 4 characters before that, that's another division. So now you can tell that we have done it correctly, according to the understanding of the ancient Chinese themselves. So, but how did they know is still the question, right? So this is something that was written on paper, therefore you can tell that it was at least something that was written hundreds of years after, at least 600 years after the original writing of the Tao Te Ching. So they had some way of knowing where the breaks were. How was that? Well, here are the key concepts to help you understand how that is. First of all, the practice of commentaries was something that almost immediately followed the original writing of the Tao Te Ching itself. So Laozi did not live in was not someone who lived in isolation. He did not exist in a vacuum. There were many other Tao scholars back in his days, people who understood him, people who knew what he was saying, and they were the ones who were able to provide the commentaries. So there were numerous other ancient writings, most of which we have lost. We just know that they existed. So it wasn't just the Tao Te Ching itself, it was also a whole bunch of supplementary material at the time. That's key concept number 1. Those commentaries would make it clear where a line ends and the next one begins. Now, most students and teachers working on the Tao Te Ching back then, along with all the text, not everybody had access to bamboo strips or silk. So mostly it depended on an oral tradition where something is taught from one generation to the next just by talking. And later on, when paper became available, we saw the ability to put in more space to denote the beginnings and endings. So process became easier. Now there's more. go to another one. So here's another piece of writing, another shot of that. Here, rather than to declare something chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, there's space. There's space at the end of a chapter. So it's not unclear at all. It's not doubtful where one begins and the next one ends because of the extra space. So that at least answers a partial question. Subsequently, it became much easier to tell. Now, when you want to think about the old days before writing on paper, I want to invite you to think about Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. This is a novel by Ray Bradbury. It's about a society, it's about a dystopian future where books have been banned. So the job of the fireman in that particular novel, very well known, is not to put out fire, but to set books on fire. And Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper burns. So in that novel, I think a lot of us, as we went through schooling, we had the opportunity to read that novel by Ray Bradbury. It's considered to be a classic. In that novel, what people decided to do to counteract this tyrannical, totalitarian control of knowledge and books is that they turned to human memory. They have people who became books, like, hello, I am Shakespeare, I am the Bible, etc. These were the people whose job it was to commit that entire volume to memory. Now, I say think Fahrenheit 451 to hopefully to give you a simple way to understand what the original Chinese people did. They didn't have paper, so they relied on human memory to a much larger extent than we do today. Today it's easy. You have your smartphone, you have your cell phone, you record information like contact information of the people that you know. You don't have to memorize everybody's phone number. It's in there. You can take notes. You can use computers. You don't need to memorize the multiplication table. You got a calculator for that. In ancient times, memory is what people use much more often. And indeed, with the Tao Te Ching, people memorized the Tao Te Ching and then recited the Tao Te Ching back, character by character. Now, here's the other key concept. When you memorize and recite it back, first, you learn from a teacher who gives it to you part by part, sentence by sentence. And you remember it in your mind the same way. Without trying to, as you memorize, you already incorporate where the pauses are, if you think about it. Okay? So if you think about the Pledge of Allegiance, for instance, when you recall it in your mind, as you memorize it, as you have it memorized, and now you recall it, you've got the pauses already in there. So that gives the ancients another way to, quote unquote, naturally know where the pauses are. So and here, what I'm doing is that I'm also putting in part of the Tao Te Ching chapter that came from this text here. The purpose here is to demonstrate that through the centuries, because of writing, because of commentaries, because of the oral tradition, generation after generation, this was a way to preserve fidelity to the original unified consolidated version of the Tao Te Ching. So now you can begin to see that even without the breaks that paper makes available, that paper makes possible to put into your writing, in the original time, when it was just bamboo strips and silk, you had to memorize it somehow so that you can pass it on and teach it to the next generation. And when you memorize it, you will naturally incorporate all the pauses. When you learn it, you will learn chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and therefore you would know exactly where one begins, where one ends and the next one begins. So these are the key concepts. Now, that's actually not the end of it. There's a little bit more. So line breaks, chapter verse breaks. So another way to do it is via context. This is common to every language, all languages, not just Chinese. So I have an example here. This is, of course, not in Chinese. This is just in English with no spaces, no pauses, no punctuation whatsoever. However, I am willing to bet that as you look at it, you can easily tell where the pauses, where the breaks are. Now, you can tell between the words because you know the spelling of the words. Now, the ancient Chinese, when they have their characters, they don't have spelling, they don't have alphabets that make up a word. So that by itself is not the point. The point is that when you've got these coming out as individual words, but no punctuation marks. Each word corresponds to a character in Chinese. No punctuation marks. You know where the one word begins and the next one, where one word ends and the next one begins. No punctuation marks, but you already know just from context that you probably have a pause after hello. And then you have another pause after you. Why? Because of the context. And then you have another pause after fine, etc. So even if punctuation marks do not exist in our world, there will be no problem for you by context to figure out where the pauses are to be between words. Now, this is only a partial solution. It gives only a hint as to where the breaks are, but it's not definitive. And some sentences can change meaning depending on where you pause. Here's my example. Panda eats shoots and leaves. Or panda eats, shoots a couple of guns, and then takes off, and then leaves. So meaning can change depending on where the comma is, which is why by context is not a complete solution. It gives only a hint. Another example, let's eat grandma. Or let's eat grandma. So punctuation can make a huge difference. The point is that even without punctuation, you are not completely helpless. Okay, this is the last slide on that subject. Because the ancient Chinese knew that they needed some way of denoting the end of something, the end of speaking, the end of a line, they needed some way to denote exclamation, question, pauses. They ended up with a different solution. They used characters at the end of a sentence to denote the end of that sentence. So this is not exhaustive. There are many other characters that are used for that purpose, not just these four. All I did was that I scanned the first 20 chapters or so of the Tao Te Ching, and I picked out the ones that are used in there. So, yeah denotes the end of a sentence. It's used in Tao Te Ching chapter 3. And then who denotes a question. It is used in chapter 5, chapter 10. Xie, another character denoting a question. It's used in 7. Zai denotes exclamation. It's used in 20. Many other examples like that. Therefore, when you have a specific character denoting the end of something, that makes it unambiguous. That makes it very clear. So these are all ancient Chinese, not used in modern Chinese anymore. There is only one example in modern Chinese, this one, ma, which denotes a question. Example, you hear this all the time when you visit China or Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong. Ni hao ma. Even without the question mark here, you know it's a question because this character makes it a question. 你 you 好 well 吗 question mark. Are you well? How are you? Is the question. So we do something similar in English when we use words like what, where, when, who, and how at the end of a sentence to indicate a question. Example, you may say, so you are going where? Even if we do not have punctuation marks, just by putting where at the end of that sentence, you know it's a question. So very similar with the character ma. So that's another, so the point here is that another way to figure out the end of a line is by watching for these characters. Now, these characters are not used on every single line, so that could make it very confusing for someone who's not used to classical or ancient Chinese. When you want to decipher ancient Chinese text, luckily today, when we study ancient Chinese, people have already done the work of separating it out into different sentences. You can imagine that an archaeologist uncovering this ancient written text may have some trouble unless they're really good with ancient classical text, in which case it becomes very clear. And they will use a combination of different methods, including this one, watching for those characters, reading the text, knowing the context, and then also consult with people that may have a variant of the memorized version that will give the pauses. So that is how we know where the lines end, where the chapters end, and the next one begins. So I think this gives you a flavor of how sometimes it can be kind of tricky to figure out the ancient text. In a way it is. In a way, because of all the work that's been done, remember, there's been commentaries since the very beginning. Therefore, the work is not as difficult as one might imagine, because in effect, you are standing on the shoulders of giants. You are taking advantage of the work that's been done through the generations. This is the reason why I say, why I absolutely categorically reject anyone who says, well, you know, the meaning of the lines are open to interpretation, and that, you know, any interpretation is just as valid as any other. I reject that because these are the people who have no idea that there's been commentaries that's been available since ancient times, and that those commentaries, that understanding has been taught generation after generation up until today. So for many of the lines, well, I would say the great vast majority of the lines, there is no doubt as to what they originally pertained, what the original meaning was. It's just that people in the West are not exposed to that ancient tradition. That is the reason why people can still make that claim and get away with it. So, my recommendations are as follows. Number one, use a translation that can match the original Chinese line for line, meaning for meaning. I don't say word for word because some English words will map to multiple Chinese characters. Some Chinese characters will map to multiple English words. So I can't say word for word. I can say meaning for meaning. And also, number two, I would say watch out for excuses about unclear translation, about vague understanding, about that lack of clarity, lack of accuracy. That denotes someone that suggests that there's someone who, number one, doesn't really understand the subject all that well. Number two, is seeking to deflect any criticism by preemptively claiming that the original was very nebulous, when in fact it is not. So, claim number one. So behind each one I have a red flag, which is an alert. Someone who says there are, well, you know, how can you say that there's an accurate way to translate the Tao Te Ching? You know, is it not true that there are numerous variations of the original text? That person is likely ignorant of the fact that ever since 1800 years ago, there's been a consolidated, unified version of the Tao Te Ching. That's the one that's produced the results in Chinese civilization for almost 2,000 years. Therefore, that is the one that we study. Second claim, each Chinese character has multiple definitions, so how can you be so sure what it really means? Well, this denotes a lack of understanding of actual Chinese. Chinese is not mysterious as a language. It's similar to English. In English, we also have a possibility that a word has multiple definitions. In fact, we can say that many words, maybe the great majority, the vast majority of the words in English have multiple definitions. Just look it up in any dictionary. No different with the Chinese. Some of the words, some of the characters have only one or very few definitions, and some, maybe the majority, have multiple definitions. Now, we're never at a loss as to what we mean to one another when we speak in English, and that's because the context is usually clear. So if I ask how you are, and you say that I am doing well, and if I ask how the business is doing, and you say that the business is doing well, I have no trouble to distinguish between personal well-being and the soundness of the business, because it's different context. It's the same in Chinese. Despite having multiple definitions possible for character, the context makes it clear which meaning we're talking about, which definition we're talking about. And another claim, translation will always be subjective. This is also not understanding that when you understand the meaning, it narrows it down to just a few possible translations per line, and they do not wander all over the place. They're not very different in meaning when you really understand what the original means. And this one is a big red flag for me. I've heard this from multiple authors. I meditate and ask Laozi to grant me wisdom to understand the original meaning of the Tao Te Ching. That is a sure sign for me that the author is working from ignorance, because whenever someone says that and I look at the result of their work, I see a huge mess. I see that they are just making guesses. So I doubt that they have communed or connected with the spirit of Lao Tzu in their meditation. I really do. And lastly, well, it's not 100%, but it serves a real spiritual need. This is usually what is brought up as an excuse for the translations that take a lot of poetic license from the original, basically expressing the author's own views and not the translated version of the wisdom of Lao Tzu. So I would say that it's not 100% is true, but most people don't realize that the real percentage of accuracy is usually below 50%, which is kind of shocking. Real spiritual need, perhaps, but when people understand what the original really says, the difference between that, the original, and the made-up version is like the difference between fast food and a gourmet meal. You always want to go for the authentic stuff. Once you develop a taste for that, there are no substitutes. Lastly, just so you know, regardless of degrees or titles or position, claims about translations being definitive are usually made by people who don't know Chinese. You see that on the back of on the back of books, on flaps, on book jackets. People who don't really have business to claim definitive, accurate nature of the translation. It doesn't matter how many degrees they have. That claim is not true. So we're going to have to wind down to today's meeting. Let me give you a preview of what I was planning to talk about next time. First, I was planning to tell you about a way, a tool that you can use at any time to see an accurate version that is line for line, meaning for meaning. Very easy on Taoism.net. I was also planning to delve into Bill's shrine in much greater detail and show you what the different characters are and what they mean and the background information behind them. There's quite a bit, as you can see. Huge amount of information there. So we'll do that next time, and before we delve into 39. For now, to summarize today, we can tell where the breaks are for the lines and verses in the Tao Te Ching because, one, it was taught via oral tradition. And when you speak the lines, you've got the pauses. Two, students memorize the text, and so in your memory, when you memorize something, you include the pauses. Three, after paper was invented, 600 years after the Tao Te Ching, there was finally room to separate them out so you can tell what the breaks are. Four, language is always contextual. So sometimes it is obvious what the breaks ought to be. Five, when it is not so obvious, there are many characters in ancient Chinese that serve the functionality of punctuation marks. So I hope that answers the question definitively. It brings us to an end of our time together today. Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everyone. 起立，面向佛堂，辞下三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，辞下多一点传世一鞠躬，结班一鞠躬。We're done for today. Thanks, everybody.